This group FIRE I mentioned earlier, it stands for Physicians Health Initiative for Radiation and Environment, and we're at firemedical.org. And I brought this together, as I say, under the umbrella of the Radiation Research Trust to bring in doctors and scientists from all over the world. And Dr. David Davis, who you just heard speak, is one of the doctors that is part of that team, I'm very proud to say, as is Leonard Ardell, who's here, who is also a medical doctor. And she mentioned Anthony Miller, who was an advisor to the World Health Organization, who has called for this to be a Group 1 known human carcinogen. And I'm very proud to say he's part of that team as well. We have an amazing group, and I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's become part of this to help support. And we hope to continue to attract medical doctors all over the world, but not just there, especially here in England, to help move education forward. So what I hope to do is very, very briefly overview. I know you've had a huge amount of different types of information today, and I'm going to very quickly recap on some of that, and then talk a little bit about children and vulnerable groups before we have some conclusions, and then question time at the end of it. And before I do that, I want to just say a thank you again to the people who've made today possible, not just the RRT, but the British Society of Ecological Medicine, who had an incredible medically based conference yesterday. This room was full of medical doctors. I guess we would have 100 at least, and other people as well. And their support in this has been absolutely incredible on every different level. And it's so nice to see a British group of doctors pioneering this and moving it forward as a group. So thank you to them. And I'm sure we'll continue to collaborate together with FIRE, which I'm delighted about. ES UK, Electrosensitivity UK, and the chairman of that group is here, I believe, Michael Bevington, and they do great work continuing with a membership of people with electrosensitivity to help increase awareness and support that group. Children with Cancer UK is an incredible charity because it's one of the only children's charities that appears to be focusing so heavily on prevention, because we don't want to be finding new cures for cancer. We don't want cancer. We want to be focusing on how to reduce this. I'm not saying we shouldn't be equally looking at how to cure it at the same time, but I'm concerned that the focus is moved too far away from preventative measures. So thank you to all those important groups that made this possible. So one of the reasons I want to talk about children today is we focused on EHS yesterday, and one of the things that I think with 5G that will move this forward massively is the people who are affected here and now, who we can talk about things that may or may not happen in 30, 40, 50 years time, which is actually very important, but actually there's a group right now who are suffering on a very high level. And I would say that's particularly people with electromagnetic hypersensitivity and children as an entire group. And to recap on some of the evidence presented today, the VGCC mechanism is something I gravitated towards some years ago because actually for clinical reasons, when I looked at electromagnetic hypersensitivity, I thought this a calcium change, a movement from the extracellular to intracellular space, actually it would explain some of the unusual symptoms we're seeing. And so I reached out for evidence in that direction, and I found some of the evidence you heard presented this morning. So it makes sense, and one of the reasons I present it is to help medical doctors understand, because they're all educated about voltage-gated calcium channels. It's something we do receive good training on. So you've heard about that. You've heard about the importance of real-life exposures and polarized fields versus natural non-polarized fields, and how those are more disruptive to biology. You've heard about the ICNRP standards that have been falsified as protective of health. You've heard about the importance of the profiling and morphology of fields and how these high-intensity, sharp profile pulsations predicted to be used with 5G are likely to be more harmful. In terms of the increased risk for glioma and acoustic neuroma that was found in human epidemiological studies, you've found how that information has been corroborated by the two largest animal studies that have ever been facilitated. And it's really unusual to have the people that were so instrumental in those studies here to speak. So thank you to them. And on the basis of all of those layers of evidence, human data, animal data, and a whole load of other types of evidence mounting to many thousands of papers. We know there are health effects, and the experts in that field are urging for this to now be classified as a group 1 known human carcinogen. That would put this with X-rays, asbestos, smoking, and we're waiting for IARC to redesignate. You've heard about some of the obstacles to medical doctors really understanding this issue and the problems with the classic paradigm of a reductionist approach. But I think medical doctors are starting to feel frustrated that they're limited, they're not getting a lot of their patients better in the way that they want to. And I know the BSCM is having higher subscriptions for people wanting to train in environmental and ecological medicine. So I want to see training packages put together in this country that will help facilitate that, and that's part of my work with FIRE. You've heard Brian talk about some political obstacles to moving forward in healthier ways, and that's a really big part of this debate. A lot of us who are medical doctors and scientists don't like to get into the politics, but we're being forced to because it's being so obstructive. You've heard about fertility compromise, secondary to RF exposures, and how profound the consequences of that could be. And we've touched on childhood sensitivity. So I'm going to move forward and we're going to talk a little bit more on a practical level about children. And we've gone very heavy on the academics and the science here today. So I've actually made this a bit lighter and talked about some of the other angles that are really relevant to schools and children. But before I do that, a lot of people have been asking about where they can get papers. They want the actual research, they want references. And so I am going to cite this amongst other websites. This is bioinitiative.org. And they, regardless of what you think of them as a group, and they're highly prestigious, by the way, they've got 3 former presidents of the Bioelectro and Magnetic Society amongst them. But what they've done is they've referenced all their literature. They've given their opinion, which is extremely valid and important. And in addition to that, they have all these references. And this is just some a snapshot of pages of the low intensity, low exposure, below safety guidelines effects. And you can find a whole list of these studies on that website. In addition, I'll just mention that there's a big database, EMF Portal, and a smaller database, ORSA, O-R-S-A-A, which is a group I'm a medical advisor for. And they also have a database where they're collecting particularly relevant papers to this debate. So getting back to the bioinitiative, oxidative stress is something that's come up a lot today. And one of the reasons, again, that I gravitated towards this is because it's very strong in the literature. When we look at literature reviews, quite often about 90% plus of papers are showing oxidative stress. And they've given an update on their website, thank you to Dr. Henry Lai, in 2019, showing this preponderance of oxidative stress. And you can see effect papers here in red versus no effect papers. And then you can also see neurological effects. That's the graph on the right. And looking at both RFR and these low frequencies, power frequencies, ELF, showing effect in red versus no effect in blue. And this is out of, on the left there, over 200 studies, and on the right, 130. So thank you to that group for their updates. And looking back in time, these reviews on oxidative stress have come up over and over again in the literature. This is Yakimenko et al. In 2015, and pointing out 93% plus. And then the Lancet Planetary Health of over 200 studies, 89% showing oxidative stress. So we don't bring this to you with no evidence. I guess that's my point. I found that yesterday, after an entire day of lectures, some of the doctors came up to me at the end and said, what we need is a really good review article. And I was like, where do I start? You know, there are so many really good review articles. And so people keep asking for more publications, let's publish this and publish that. And I'm not suggesting we don't do that. I think that's a great idea. But we do need a different strategy because, as has been said so many times today, the scientific debate in terms of is this causing real harm or not, that debate ended a long time ago. This has become a PR war, not a scientific one. In terms of when you look at something that causes oxidative stress or cellular mechanism, we get systemic disruption. And we know that this is heavy in the neurological system. And that can have knock-on effects on all the other systems. And we've heard how there's very strong evidence looking at reproductive impairment. And all of these different endpoints, which can be credibly linked. Now, when I first put this slide together, loosely speaking, I put ones on the left that were more common in children, perhaps, and on the right, more common in adults. And I've been watching the statistics, and it's just heartbreaking that we have dementias in people in their 40s and 50s. This is really increasing. And cancer, migraines, depression, insomnia in children, various forms of cancer increasing in children. Brain tumour is now the leading cause of death in children. It's overtaken leukemia from cancer. And depression has become a terminal illness in our children, for some, which is something we have to take incredibly seriously. I think mood disturbance on a graph like this alongside cancer some years ago would have been trivialised, but we can no longer think of it like that. And electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which I spoke on yesterday, and that talk will be available. And what I emphasised with that talk, because we had medical doctors here, was the fact that with electromagnetic hypersensitivity, it's time that this was brought into the general practice forum. What I want to see happening with EHS is for general practitioners to be diagnosing this, because there is enough in terms of publications for them to read and understand the basics of this condition and to diagnose it themselves. Because if we can pick this up in its mildest form at the very beginning and have it not progress to a really debilitating condition, that would make all the difference in the world in terms of preventative healthcare. And when you think about the symptoms of that, which is headaches, palpitations, dizziness, we talked about this earlier, how common are those on a mild level in society? So given that this debate is often all about money, how much could we save as a group if we could give people a better general level of health, if they weren't off work with a migraine or feeling sick and dizzy? So this could have profound impacts. Now, it's not all about humans. I mentioned this earlier. Birds, bees, animals, plants. These are something that are affected. And I know there's a question about insects. And what I've done is, when I was beavering away on the computer, I wasn't being rude or distracted. What I was doing was taking all of your questions that you put in earlier on pieces of paper, and I was taking slides out of my presentation and putting them underneath your questions to help answer some of them. And we're also going to answer them in a panel debate after this. So let's get back to children. You've heard many times today that children are more vulnerable, and this is for a variety of reasons, but their skulls are thinner, their brains, especially neonates, have a higher water content that makes them very efficient microwave absorbers. If you've ever put food in a microwave, some bits are cold and some bits come out red hot, and that's because things like tomatoes with a high water content really absorb microwaves incredibly well, and so do their brains and a lot of their other systems. And of course, they're still developing. They have a high content of what are called stem cells, which are exquisitely sensitive to this kind of radiation. And they have a longer time ahead of them. You know, for our generation, we grew up in a relatively low RF environment. This generation, from cradle to grave, even from conception, have unprecedentedly high levels of exposure. And you've heard these statistics from Deborah, so I won't bore you. And you've seen this, how the radiation can penetrate so much more deeply through their developing brain. But I think when we talk about kids, we have to think about what our problem right here and now is. What are children dying of? And of course, it's not all about mortality. It's about morbidity, which I think is a huge discussion in itself. But when we look at the National Office of Statistics figures for what's killing our children, 5 to 19-year-olds this is, number one on this graph is suicide and poisoning. Now, a few years ago, I got the same statistics, and about 3 years ago, it wasn't nearly this high, and we've been hearing about this in the media all the time. Then comes road traffic accidents, and then below that for women is brain tumours. Well, I say women, this is girls, this is little girls. It's brain tumours. And you could argue that actually almost everything on this list can be in some ways related to RF, including traffic accidents, but we're not going there in this particular talk today. But my point here is, if IARC has expressed concern that brain cancer might be caused in humans by radiofrequency radiation, and you've heard today how much stronger that evidence has become, and our children are dying of brain cancer more than ever before, then why aren't we being warned to restrict their use? And the answer is, here in the UK, you are being warned, you just didn't know about it. So this is from an NHS advice leaflet that I don't think anyone's ever seen or heard of. And I'll take a quote from here. The UK Chief Medical Officers advise that children and young people under 16 should be encouraged, I love this industry-friendly wordage, to use mobile phones for essential purposes only and to keep calls short. Now, the problem with this excellent warning that was put out there years ago, by the way, is that nobody was told. Parents weren't told, governors weren't told, head teachers weren't told, and schools are prescribing their homework on mobile phones right now. And there's this huge inconsistency that's very, very unscientific. It says we've got this warning, and then there's equal support for the one-on-one iPad scheme. Now, an iPad or any other tablet can potentially have a higher SAR or specific absorption rate than a mobile phone. So why do we give with one hand and restrict with the other? There's no sense in this. Now, the argument they would probably give is, oh, but they're not putting it to their head, so it doesn't matter. Now, you've seen the data produced today that suggests that this could be a multi-organ carcinogen, as well as having serious effects on fertility. And they're using tablets right here by their sensitive abdominopelvic organs. Who is accountable is a question that's come up in question time, but I've got a little bit to say on this. So I wonder, should health protection agencies be accountable? After all, it's part of the name, isn't it? Except it's not part of the name of our health protection agency anymore. They changed their name to Public Health England, which somewhat implies watching public health evolve rather than actually intervening, which appears to be what's happened on this particular subject. Now, this very important paper was published by a colleague of mine, Sarah Starkey, a few years ago, and it's peer-reviewed. And what she's done here is she has assessed what's called the AGNIR report. This is what's used in the UK. It was published in 2012. And this was designed to give guidance to groups in the UK about this kind of radiation. And it's still being used, despite the fact that this group disbanded some time ago. Her concern is that this report is not reflective of the actual scientific literature. And to represent that, there's a lot of data in there, so please do read it. But to give a snapshot, their executive summary said this: taken together, these studies provide no convincing evidence of health effects, none. There was a complete whitewash of the fact that, for example, of the available data, she noticed that 78% of papers had showed damage to male fertility, 94% damage to proteins, and 100% damage to cell membranes, which is kind of important. So why was there this massive whitewash of the results of this investigation? She suggested, could it be because of conflicts of interest? The chairman of this group, AGNIR, at the time of writing the report, was also the chairman of ICNIRP, Standing Committee on Epidemiology. What this means in real-life terms is the person tasked with assessing the validity of the current guidelines also helped to write those guidelines. Now, this group has in their name that they're independent, but I would very much suggest that that may not be true given that fact, and there were other conflicts of interest that were represented and brought up in that very important paper. Now, some people point the finger at industry and say, well, it's their fault because their gadgets are emitting the radiation. The problem is industry has been very clear that they don't say it's safe. Other people say it's safe. They don't say that. And in all fairness, they do put copious warnings in their manuals about the fact that when rats use your phones, they got twice as many cancers, or that you must keep it a certain distance from your body. And you've heard how that doesn't work in real life, and your exposures are much higher than they should be if you use it the way we all do when we're trying to hear in a busy environment. So they've warned the public about the concern. And this is, you've heard this brought up, so I'm going to skip through this a little bit. But this is pointing out that many phones are currently exceeding even those thermal heating guidelines where we know damage is done. And that's peer-reviewed and published by Gandhi. So it's kind of no surprise, looking at the layers of evidence that we've seen today, that courts of law have already ruled that mobile phones can give you brain tumours. And things often move faster in the legal setting than they do in the scientific forum, which is not really how life should be. You've heard about the fact that insurance companies will not cover. Now, I introduced this deliberately because, in all fairness, understanding the level of science that's been presented today is not easy. And there'll be plenty of people in this audience that don't have the background required to analyse that scientific debate and know who is right and who is wrong. But insurance companies are risk analysts. This is their raison d'être. This is what they do. And if they won't cover, then that should be a warning to anyone who doesn't understand the science that the debate is done. And this is Swiss Re, implying the high impact of health claims, especially after 3 years. So, and that was 5G. They've called it 5G off the leash mobile networks. And legal firms now have offered no win, no fee support for people claiming Wi-Fi injury. This is the kind of collateral evidence that is not scientific, but I think conveys the message of the fact that this is real and it's happening. And in terms of accountability, when we're thinking about kids, if a child gets an RF-related problem because of Wi-Fi in their classroom, who is accountable for that? This is such an important question, and it's not being answered. And health and safety at work, or a teacher, because we have a number of teachers becoming electrosensitive. And if that happens, who is accountable? Well, health and safety at work law would suggest it might be the employer. But when it comes to the children in school, we're all responsible. When it comes to safeguarding a child, each and every one of us is accountable. When you have heard the information, if you feel like it's genuine evidence, then we all have a duty of care to make something change. So I have limited ability to accept from head teachers and governors who have been given this information, by parents usually, that it's not their fault, somebody else is saying it's fine. I mean, it's a difficult position they're in, I do get that, but I think there needs to be more investigation of this from schools themselves. In terms of litigation, EHS is being recognised as a disability in both the adult and the child population in this country. Brain tumour case is currently progressing, and there's a big class action brain tumour lawsuit going on right now in the States, and these cases will continue to come, and that may be the best route to change. I'm sad to say, because it would be better if it were facilitated faster in a political forum. France has banned Wi-Fi for under 3s and limited it for under 6s for health reasons, so vive la France. And the American Academy of Pediatrics have had statements out there for a long time suggesting that we must be using hardwired networks to protect children. And perhaps one of the best position papers that I have read through all of this journey comes from the Cyprus Medical Association in combination with the Vienna and Austrian medical chambers and the Cyprus National Committee on the Environment and Children's Health. So this is a governmentally endorsed statement. And I'm going to read you a few excerpts from this. They point out that carcinogenicity, developmental neurotoxicity, effects on DNA, on fertility and hypersensitivity can be occurring potentially at extremely low levels of intensity and exposure. That the damages could be serious and in some cases irreversible. That wireless networks should be prohibited in schools, particularly in preschools. And that parents should be empowered to demand a safe environment at home and at school. So those are really powerful words from a really credible group, and they've actually put information videos out to help schools and parents understand. And you can find that on YouTube if you Google Cyprus Medical Association, Wi-Fi or phones. So there's so much going on, and there's a lot of debate about, let's turn the routers off when we're not using them, or let's switch the Wi-Fi off on the computers when we're not using them. There's a lot of half measures happening, which I understand why, because people are trying to do what they can. But if we're being really purist about this and honest, it's a bit like saying they can all smoke low-tar cigarettes and that's all right. At this point, we're thinking there are scientists saying this could be a group 1 carcinogen. If they're right, then that's not the way to handle this. If they're right, then we need to be switching devices off immediately. And I think we have to behave with the precautionary principle as if they're right, because that's sensible. Because let's face it, it's a risk versus benefit debate. And why are we using Wi-Fi in classrooms? And that's a serious question, so I'm going to ask you. Does anyone want to shout out, why are we using Wi-Fi in a classroom? Well, there's a bit of a silence, because the answer is there's no good reason. This has not been shown to be of educational benefit. And we're not talking here about children no longer using the internet. That's not what we're saying. We're saying use the internet in the correct place educationally via a hardwired connection. And you can hardwire your tablets. You can even hardwire a phone. This is something a lot of people don't realise. But you can use WhatsApp and you can use Skype to even make a call from a phone that has every component of RF disabled and using an Ethernet cable instead. And when I've presented this to schools a few times, they've said, oh, but we'll be tripping over cables all over the place. And I point out to them that the military as an institution have been hardwired all the way through. They have never used radio frequency to communicate, and they're hardly Luddite technophiles, are they? They're coping. If the military can survive like that, so can a primary school. So we need to make a big change. And in support of some of the emergency actions that I think we need, I've set up this. I've called it SAFER Project, SAFER Initiative, Safe Area for Electromagnetic Refuge. And this can be implemented on a grand scale, a scale of many square miles, which I would like to see happen, but also on a very small scale, in a school, in a hospital, in a GP surgery, even in a restaurant. And what this is based on is a concept that I set up many years ago when I was fantasizing about safe zones for people. But basically, the idea of it is a very, very low epicenter of EMF, as close to natural background as we can get it, with a sort of a circular pattern outwards that blends with normality at the other side of it. And at night time, the important thing is that it must go right down to base limits, in order to protect circadian rhythm and many other things that we don't have time to go into. But so it was a concept, and then a group got together in the UK called IGNIR that I'm a member of, and we have now structured some really useful practical guidelines based on the Europa 2016 guideline, which is a scientific document, and Dr. Onsorge is one of the authors of that document. I think it's excellent. So what we did was we thought, well, this is good, but it's not accessible to everyone. It's quite a scientific paper. We're going to translate this into something practical that anybody can use. So you can go to ignir.org and you'll find tables that give numerical values for things that we can measure with fairly standard meters that can be either hired or bought. And you can take various readings, and again, I'm not going to go through all the numbers right now, but it's looking at different forms of electromagnetism. So VLF in the middle is the one that's a bit more dubious, but the RF frequencies and the extremely low frequencies that are easy to measure, we've given clear values for how those can be measured and implemented at a lower level. And most importantly, you can see here on the right, that's the ICNRP guidelines. This is what we're advocating with IGNIR, is not natural background radiation, because to be honest, that's almost unachievable with the level of ambient pollution that we have. But we'd like to get as close as possible. And in terms of how you achieve it, that's beyond the scope of these particular talks today, but there is some practical guidance on the kinds of things that emit and how to turn them off and how to replace them and hardwire. And that group have just made a little sticker or poster that people can print out to advertise we're being proactive at protecting health. We've got an I really struggle with that word, which is why I never use it maybe, an electromagnetic quiet zone, an EQZ, where you turn your phone off as soon as you walk in, you put it in flight mode. Who needs to be in this zone? Well, we've mentioned that I originally had this concept to protect people with electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but we can't be exclusive to that group, can we? Because we know that so many other disease processes appear to be linked in the literature. So the list becomes very, very long. And then we think about vulnerable groups and we think, but, we need to take care of our children. So the question more becomes not who should be in that zone, but who shouldn't be in that zone. And I would say, really, at this point, this brings us on to the ethical issue of consent. And to me, the 5G debate is all about consent, as it is actually to the previous generations, but we haven't had enough public interest to have that debate until now. So if you have read all the literature and you have a background where you feel comfortable saying, I understand the risk that I'm taking and I consent to this, I want to use 5G, that's all fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Knock yourself out with as much non-ionizing radiation as you like. If Martin Paul's right, then that will take that group out of the gene pool at some point. But what I do have a problem with is the idea that people who feel that they don't want to be exposed, for whatever reason, frankly, they should not be forcibly exposed to radiation that has been shown very credibly to be messing up their biology. So this brings me on to the 5G appeal, and I want to say a massive thank you to the people who set that up. I think Leonard Hardell, you were part of that group. And initiating these kinds of international appeals are so important, and to all the people who've signed it. But to give you an idea of what's being said, it's saying that present levels are already toxic, that harm to human and other biology is proven, strong words, absolutely well evidenced, and that harm is evidenced below safety limits, and this will, of course, increase exposures. And then there's a long list of the different damages, much of which you've heard discussed today. And then we come to the Nuremberg Code, which I think is so important. So the Nuremberg Code was something set up after the war to stop involuntary human experimentation. And it's not been talked about very much since that point, because as doctors, we have very careful ethical constraints on what we can and cannot do. And we never come anywhere close, I hope, to breaking any of these golden rules, which we understand because they're obvious, they're common sense that you don't put people in this position. Yet somehow we find ourselves in the position with 5G that on a massive scale, every single one of these points is being breached. Now, if we find ourselves with loads of time at the end of the day, I'm happy to go through these one by one, and we can talk through what are the ways in which they're being breached. But I might just mention one point, which is, it says here, the experiments should be done on animals first. Well, you've just seen so much data, and there's a lot more than that that goes back historically a long way. So, this isn't an experiment. People keep calling it an experiment, and I understand why, and it is to some degree. But we know so much that it's not purely experimental. It's not that we have no idea what's going to happen. And again, it brings up this massive issue of consent. That's at the very heart of that document, is consent. So in terms of what's being requested by the 5G appeal, it's so reasonable, it's so humble. It's to say, please, can we stop and breathe and stop the race, this ridiculous race, and actually have proper debates where the public can hear the two sides of this discussion and have an opportunity to read the science for themselves, to either consent or withhold consent, and have that decision respected. So to support this initiative, I put together this leaflet. I called it the 5G 5 Facts. People kept saying to me, what's FIRE doing about this? And I thought, oh no. At the moment, I was so swamped, I thought, I'm not sure what I'm doing about it. So I wanted to do something that I thought would be really useful on a base level. And I shared this with all my colleagues when I put it together, and I said, are you all happy that this information is correct and valid? And large doctors' groups, including the Environmental Health Trust, including the EMF core group, so this consists of hundreds of doctors in total, have signed off that the information in this is valid and they're comfortable with it. I've then started changing it for a Wi-Fi in school situation. So we're going to have another trifold leaflet printed on both sides that people can use to get a snapshot of available evidence on Wi-Fi in schools. And I'll be uploading a load of the references that are relevant to the facts in that leaflet onto our webpage as well. So in terms of the three things that I've been focusing on with work in FIRE, it's the 5G 5 Facts, the Safe Schools Initiative, which is mainly increasing awareness and trying to support governors and head teachers in terms of understanding that this is progressive, moving to hardwired technology like the military does and like people in Silicon Valley do, because it's more secure, it has better longevity, it's got faster internet speeds, and actually you can do all the healthy things that you could be using technology for anyway. This is the message I want to get out. This can be such a positive change, especially in school, where it's, the infrastructure for RF is redundant. It does not need to be there. It actually, I have done this with some schools already, and I'll be honest, the feedback has been fantastic. So a state primary school engaged with me and they said, we want to do this, tell us what to do. And I got involved, and it took them a few weeks and not that much money. It was a small school, in fairness, but they completely hardwired. They had tablets. They were using Wi-Fi previously. They hardwired that system. They plugged in their tablets, and they said to all staff, you need to put your phones in airplane mode during the day, please, when you walk in. Pupils have never been allowed mobile phones anyway. They took their staff landlines and they hardwired them. And I said, now you're probably going to have some grumbling. So after a few weeks, come back to me, tell me all the problems you're having, and I'll help you troubleshoot. And I went back to that school after a couple of months because I hadn't heard anything. And I said, come on, tell me all the problems. And they said, we're so delighted. We feel, as a whole school, I asked the individual teachers to be sure that they weren't just trying to please me. The individual teachers said, we feel so much more relaxed in the classroom. We're not being bothered by trivial texts from family and friends, and that we're interrupting our teaching. We feel like we're delivering a better education, and the children are not distracted by a whole load of stuff on YouTube that they really shouldn't have been watching. So it works, it can work, and I'm not suggesting it's not harder in a big busy secondary school because it requires more discussion, but this can begin. The Safer initiative I've already talked through, which is low EMF zones within buildings but also on a larger scale. And lastly, I just want to say really that in terms of my background as a medical doctor in this country, it was beaten into me from the day that I started. We have to take an evidence-based medical approach. And it's true. That's very, very important. I worry sometimes that important anecdotal evidence at the beginning of something, because you don't start with evidence, you have to accrue evidence. Sometimes, so there are some issues where you still have to embed common sense in that approach. But yes, of course we do need evidence. And the problem is that the evidence is on this side of the debate. So what happens is, when the evidence base is there but it's inconvenient, then all of a sudden we don't take an evidence-based approach. Everything that I got taught for my whole medical career is not being implemented by our own health advisory bodies. So this is what I think, and in a moment I'm going to ask my colleagues whether they feel the same about these 5 points. Current non-ionising radiation safety guidelines are not safe. Serious biological disruption is occurring at non-thermal intensities. Negative health effects are occurring already widely in the community. The scientific evidence of harm is now indisputable. And to deploy 5G is a contradiction of scientific evidence, medical integrity, and our ethical responsibility. One of the large obstacles to this is ignorance. I'm not naive, I know there are others. But your voices, all of you, and the group yesterday that was a whole room of medical doctors, your voices count, they're important, every single one of you. So it's time to rethink how we can make this situation better, and we're going to bring this heavily into the question time that's about to come. I'm not going to go through all of these points because I feel like we've covered them so well, but let's focus on solutions and the fact that they need to come quickly. This is my group FIRE, and these are our points of action that I'll just leave on the screen while we talk. And you can join free. There's no membership, and we take absolutely anyone and everyone from any background, because I think it needs a very united approach. Thank you so much.